Welcome back to the WinCAMS channel. Today we are going to be talking about reporting in WinCAMS. So reports can be accessed from each module by going to CAMS and then into the module and then into the reports section. So here's applied charges reporting, here's budget expenditures reporting. Okay, or you can go to the speed button that for reports and then drop into the module and you're only looking at reports. You won't have this many modules. This is pretty much every module we have at our office. So you'll only have the modules that are in your contract. The first thing to think about with reports is, what report do I want? So thinking about first of all, thinking about what you want the source of your report to be. So maybe I'll pick time card audit trail. If I want a listing of all of my vendors, maybe I will go into direct charges and pick a vendor listing. Okay. Now, thinking about posting in CAMS, as you probably know, you enter source documents, then you audit and reconcile them in whatever way you see fit, and then you post them to hit the ledgers. So when you report on a source document, such as the time card audit trail, then you're reporting on things that were entered, that could have been entered 5 seconds ago. Okay, you may be reporting on posted records, unposted records, depending on what you ask for, etc. Okay, and when you report on, when you go into reports like in a destination ledger, like projects, like a ledger report, then you're generally only reporting on things that have been posted to that ledger. Okay. The next thing you want to think about is, what sort of level of detail do I want? You'll notice here in the ledgers that you'll see oftentimes a listing. That's literally what it sounds like. It's oftentimes doesn't even have cost figures. It's a listing of all the whatever module we're in, the projects, for instance. Then a ledger report is a very high level report that says, how much have we spent year to date, life to date, prior year, current year, or something like that on the projects I'm interested in. Then an expenditure summary detail is drilling down into the actual expenditures of the projects I'm looking at, which may be rolled up during posting. So if you post 20 time cards to this project, that we might roll them up into $500 worth of labor charge. And then a cost source report is something you'll see in projects, cost centers. Let's see, a couple other places where we'll actually we'll take a project charge, for instance, and then we'll go dig out the detail of who worked on it on what day for how many hours, etc., or details from the invoice or journal or wherever the source document, the material usage, wherever it came from. So that's the first thing to think about. One thing I always tell people with reports is, don't be afraid. There's nothing you can hurt in a report. So it's totally fine to just go into a report and say, I wonder what this report does. So I call this the go button. So you just hit go, let it count up, and there we go. I don't know what it was doing. And it will pop up in the preview window. If yours does not pop up in the preview window, use this white paper here and select always preview reports before printing. Okay, I don't even want it to ask me. I always want to preview. Okay, so now I can say, I have some clients that say that take a page of each report and put it into a binder, just so they know kind of what things look like. So once you've selected a report that you want to work in, now there are 4 things to think about. Okay, the first thing we're going to think about is, what data do we want to see? This is filtering. Okay, so that's going to be the selection criteria tab. So this vendor listing report has selection. It starts out as all, and that's what I got when I hit that. Or I can customize my selection criteria and pick only vendors with status of active, or I could pick a specific vendor. You'll notice that if I pick a field here, then I've got include, the include box, and the exclude box. And so I can use both of them if I want. And you also notice that when I use a lookup here, it doesn't look like the lookups. If you use a lookup in a data entry facility in CAMS, then whatever you pick is going to just go into the cell and you'll be back into data entry. Here, I can pick multiple things. I can double click, and say I want this and that and this with commas in between. Or I can say I want this and then say begin range and go through this, okay, end range. And I can also type that stuff in right here, okay. So if I want, so the first thing I want to think about is which records do I want, okay. So that's my selection criteria, and I can include A through M and exclude K, or include January 1st through April 1st and exclude a week in February. All that stuff is possible. I can even put my cursor in there and say I only want to include. So if I put my cursor in there, let's look at vendor categories. I have, oh, there we go. I have auto supplies and communications. Those are the two vendor categories I have. So I could say I want to only show vendors that have autos, that are their categories auto supplies. Let's try that. See if we've got any good data in there. Okay, so I add it up there. I hit the go button. There we go. Okay, so I've got 4 vendors that are listed as servicing auto supplies or selling auto supplies. I can also use the same thing we saw in the search video, which is I can say I can pick vendor category and say I only want to include things, and I go into the include and I hit add with nothing there, and it will say include none. So now I'm saying show me all the vendors that have no vendor category. Okay, so you can see that my vendor category over here is blank. Okay, so that's selection criteria. The next thing I want to think about is what order do I want these things to come out in, and that's control breaks. If control breaks intimidate you, then that's fine. Just use, every report has some standard options. Do we want a vendor listing by vendor number, by vendor name, by vendor category? If I go to a time card audit trail, I can see here's some standard commonly used time card date and then employee and then time card date. So if I click employee and then time card date and I go to my control breaks, there's employee and then date. But you have much more control if you work in the control breaks tab. Okay, so what this means is every time, so I'm going to go in order by employee, and then every time the employee changes, I am going to subtotal the employee and then provide a header for the next employee. A section description is what we call it. So I'm going to view a sample report here. So there's my section description saying employee ABC, and then I drop into my second sort, which is date, and I show the date. Then I show some number of lines of data or pages of data, or maybe one line of data, and then I subtotal the date as we move along. And I might go to another date, but then I'm going to subtotal the employee. Okay. If I want things in order, but I don't want them to subtotal, I can drag them down into here. Okay, and so now I'm saying break on employee, but sort within breaks by date. Okay, so now if you look at my sample report, you can see it doesn't show anything about date here because it's just going to say these data lines are in order by date. Okay, so I've got lots of fields to select on here. And by the way, for selection criteria, if you see fields in the time card or even in a secondary or tertiary table that you see in CAMS that you don't see it as a selection criteria, you can just send us an email and we can usually get it thrown in there. The yellow fields are indexed so they increase the speed of the report, the functioning of the report. And by the way, this is the cancel button. So that's the worst thing that can happen with a report is you get you hit go and it looks like it's going to take 10 minutes and you don't want to wait. So I would just hit cancel and then go and reduce your selection criteria. More on control breaks. So you can highlight a control break here, and it says required. That does not mean you're required to break on employee. What that means is when I run a report by employee, does that mean I only want to see things that have employees, or does it mean I want a section for no employee? Every time card is going to have an employee. But what if I was running the report by something else, such as a project? Okay. So if I'm running the report by project, well, not every one of my time cards has a project. So then it really matters if I'm required or not. Okay, so I can always right-click it and say not required. So what that means is I'm going to have a section that says here's the time cards that have no project in them. Okay. With employee and with date, it really doesn't matter in this case because every time card has an employee and every time card has a date. Other things I can do by right-clicking is I can remove the break from my list, and I can tell it to page break. So every time the project changes, of course in this case it's underneath employee and date, every time the project changes, then kick a new page and do new headers. Okay. And then I can tell it to do a descending order instead of normal ascending order. Okay, so you can set up some funny breaks that I guess I'll talk about later. But let's see what happens with this setup here. Okay, you'll notice that I've got project, employee, date. Okay, so why don't I go ahead and hit go? See what happens. Okay, so you'll notice that I've got project here with lead elements. It looks like there's a department on the front, and I've got an invalid one in there, but apartment, and then Big Lagoon storm damage, and then it found that Bernie worked on this project in 2015. My test data is a little bit old. Okay, and then I'll notice, well, where are the hours, and where are the charges, and where is whatever else I might want to see. So that's the third thing we want to look at here. That's this button here, choose columns. Okay, so I've got all these columns to choose from, and also if you have any columns that you don't see in here that you would like to be able to use in the report, just send us an email and we'll get it in there, usually free of charge. And so this is just I guess the last time I used this report, it was employee by activity, or employee, and then showing it. So I got employee column, activity column, and activity code column. So these are two different views. This is the division activity, and this is just the activity with the description on it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit defaults here. So this is how we deliver it. Okay. Now I'm going to use a button here that's kind of cool. So I could just hit run the report again, and it would go back to the database and look at my selection criteria, which is nothing, but it's going, and it would start over. But I can also hit this reprint report without recollecting. This is especially useful if a report takes a couple minutes and all I did was change some columns. So if you hit reprint report, it'll take the temporary tables that it already built and just show you more columns, or show you or reprint it with your new column headers, right? Okay, so now the report starts to look more like what I want. I've got 4 pages, and it shows me the project and then the employee, because remember my control breaks were project, employee, and then date. So then it drops in and shows me a header for a date, and then it shows me the date. Okay, now this seems a little bit redundant, so maybe I don't need a header for a date. See, I've got 10/21/15, and then I've got the date field right in the meat line of the report. So maybe I go here and I'm going to remove date. Okay, so now I try this. It won't let me do it because I need, when you change the sort order, it's going to want to recollect which is fine, but you can always try it. Okay, so now you see I don't have 4 pages anymore. I have 2 pages. Okay, and so now you can see that there's no subtotaling by date, and that may be okay. So I can see that Bernie worked 4 hours on. He had 2 different lines of 4 hours on this date, but I don't have a subtotal of 8 hours on the 22nd, okay, for this project. So it depends on who my audience is and etc. This up here is my header page. It comes out on its own page, and it will be centered on the page when it tells me the name of the report. It tells me what order I ran it in, who ran it and when, and what fiscal year I was running, okay? And then some of that information is repeated at the top of every page. So now I start looking at this and I say, well, those defaults are a little bit overkill. I don't actually need all this. So I'm going to double click on the rate. I'm going to double click on this rate. I don't want to see overhead. I'm not interested in materials or accomplishments. So then I go back here. Oh, and by the way, I can move things up or down, meaning left or right in my columns, okay? So now I'll rerun it or reprint without recollecting. So now I've got a little bit tighter report. Now I notice that none of my, oh, there's a little bit of equipment there. Okay, that's good. One thing I notice is that I've got my project here as a header, right, a section description, and I've got my employee here as another section description, and then I've got some of the same information in each line. Now that is totally personal preference, so I could get rid of that information. So watch what happens if I get rid of employee and name. I get a little bit tighter report, and for me, I can see that because of the indenting, that Bernie applies to each of these 3 lines here, and then here's my subtotal. However, where I might want to repeat Bernie on every line is, watch what happens when I go to Excel. This is the Export to Excel button. And my computer doesn't go too fast when we're recording, but here's Excel, and so you can see here it's a pretty interesting report, but the employee is here, and then the meaty information is here. Okay, so that's fine, but if I want to do some pivoting or some sorting by employee or whatever, I may want the employee on every line. Okay, so now let's try that, where I go back and I say, actually, I do want the employee on every line, and I want the name on every line. Okay, and maybe I don't want charges. Okay, okay. So now I've got these on every line, and if I push to Excel now, I can sort better if I need to. So depending on my audience. So another thing to think about with pushing to Excel is you'll notice that in my report, here's my header, here's my project header, section description, here's my employee section description, here's my data matching this data, but where's my subtotal? Well, that's because in my settings, okay, if I go to export, I said include column titles, include section titles, but I said do not include subtotals. And I'll show you why a lot of people say that. Let's push, I now turned on the subtotals. Okay, so there's my subtotals. Okay, but notice that when I click on one, it's just 10. It's not actually a subtotal. It's not actually a formula of this. So I get people sometimes that say, well, I changed this to 3 and this stayed 10. Yes, that's exactly what's going to happen because it's not an actual subtotal formula. So some people like to make their own subtotals in Excel.